In the beginning, there were the Jews. And then one of them got crucified. Various accounts of the events leading up to and following this crucifixion were compiled into a single book. This book then formed the basis of worship for a bunch of funny Jews, but we'll have to check back in with them later. Because, in another beginning, there were the Trojans. And then they got invaded by the entire Greek world. Semi-mythical accounts from the veterans of this invasion rapidly entered the Greek oral tradition. Eventually, the combined tellings and retellings of these accounts will be written down, turning them into the finest literary works of the Greek world, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Unfortunately, the Greek world wouldn't remain under Greek rule forever, as they'd soon get themselves conquered by the Romans. It was those very same Romans who were responsible for that aforementioned crucifixion. And in spite of being responsible for having committed the act, the Romans seemed to have a weird sense of guilt about the whole thing, and so joined that strange sect of Jews in worshipping it. And so, through Rome, Greek and early Christian cultures combined, producing the very first Western culture. And with it, a brand new Western literary tradition. It was from this tradition that the subject of today's video would emerge, so you can call me Ezekiel. This is the origin of American literature. Let's jump in! Following the fall of Rome, Europe was not a good place to be. Reason as a way to gain knowledge was rejected, strict adherence to religious moral teachings was mandated, and politics was dominated by warlord kings. These kings, by their very nature, had no real reason to care about morality. Power was what they were after. However, these kings had a unique problem to contend with. You see, just like in the rest of the world, these warlords had to at least pretend to care about morality. But, unlike in the rest of the world, that morality could neither come from themselves nor from someone under their direct control. It had to come from the largely independent Pope. This was a peculiar situation, possibly unique in the whole world. Because of it, if a king wanted to invade his neighbor, or divorce his wife, or commit any number of other acts which the Christian world would consider immoral, the Pope would very often intervene to stop him. Now, sometimes the popes did this out of legitimate concern for the moral future of Christendom. But let's not kid ourselves. Most of the time, it was done for power of their own. But regardless of the motive, the very risk of upsetting the moral order would always keep the kings of Europe at least somewhat in line. However, this reality was not to last, because a combination of political, social, and philosophical factors resulted in religious upheaval in Europe, culminating in the Protestant Reformation. Because of it, much of Europe, especially parts distant from the Pope in Rome, were able to break away from Catholicism, and the moral obligations that came with it. One of the religious factors behind the Protestant Reformation was the Catholic Church's sympathy for Aristotelianism. You see, by this point, the Catholic Church was in the process of hybridizing Aristotelian reason and divine revelation. This upset many of the people who would soon become Protestants, because to them, the Bible was the only valid source of knowledge, which meant that Aristotelian reason was not only wrong, but dangerous and immoral. But while many Protestant sects do have radical anti-reason doctrines, nothing necessarily forces the Protestants to reject reason. After all, the thing that really unites them isn't radical theology, but opposition to the Catholic Church. So now free from that church's control, the new Protestant world found itself in a strange position. For hundreds of years, they turned to the Pope to find moral truth, and they just got rid of him. So if not the Pope, then who should they turn to for moral guidance? This question was on the mind of one of the English-speaking world's greatest writers, William Shakespeare. Throughout his greatest work, Hamlet, Shakespeare depicts in all of its horror the grim reality Protestant Europe was facing. He wastes no time in establishing this theme either, as the play begins right after the titular Hamlet returns home from the University of Wittenberg, the very place where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door and started this whole moral mess. There, Hamlet realized that in Protestant Europe, they had totally lost their sense of right and wrong. Here, a king will say that he determines morality, and there, an insane priest will say the same. Hamlet even famously soliloquizes, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Ironically, in this scene, Hamlet is pretending to be mad, but today, many people will say the same exact thing while pretending to be sane. But by the play's conclusion, even Hamlet forgets whether he's actually a madman or is just playing the part. But while Shakespeare was a great enough man to raise the question, it was simply beyond his power to answer it, leaving others to finish the job. And so, an attempt will be made by England's very own Puritans. They answer with radical interpretations of the Bible. Unfortunately, this vision somewhat conflicted with that of the King of England, who, like many other men of his status, wanted to control morality for himself. So the Puritans escaped to the colonies in America, building Boston, Massachusetts. It's here, in Puritan Boston, where Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter takes place. This novel focuses on a common theme in early American literature. It examines symbols, what they mean, and where that meaning comes from. Our protagonist, Hester Prynne, is surrounded by symbols all throughout the novel, the most important being, of course, the Scarlet Letter A which she's forced to sew onto her clothes. In and of itself, the letter symbolizes the adultery Hester Prynne committed, and which incited the novel's events. But with time, it begins to take on new meanings. Hester Prynne encounters many opportunities to remove it, and to do so in such a way that no one would ever find out. And yet, in spite of that, she was never able to free herself from it. Further adding to her torment, her bastard child, Pearl, since infancy, was fascinated with the letter. In Hawthorne's Puritan Boston, it was no longer mysticism and biblical radicalism that determined society's morality. It was the society itself. The influence of that social morality was immense. Hester couldn't escape it by removing the Scarlet Letter, and soon, we find out that her illicit lover couldn't escape it either, because at the very end of the book, he's found dead with the Scarlet Letter A branded onto his skin. We don't even get to find out who did it, so in a sense, the society itself was the culprit. Hester Prynne's society marked her as evil for violating its rules, and through its influence, she even seemed to mark herself as evil. So is that America's answer to morality? That society, in all of its capriciousness and irrationality, will determine morality? No, because another author had a totally different approach to discovering the truth. It's from his magnum opus that all of American literature emerges: Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. The first two-thirds of Huckleberry Finn are the first, and perhaps greatest work of truly American literature. It takes place on that all-American river, the Mississippi, and its protagonists are the titular Huckleberry Finn and the escaped slave Jim, who travel together on their mutual quest for freedom. But an interesting detail is that Huck never actually chose to travel with Jim. They merely joined together as a matter of convenience. And so, after many adventures together, a certain fact began to make itself clear to our young hero. It was illegal, immoral, and impious to keep traveling with, and so help free Jim. It went against his country's laws, his community's morality, and even God himself. Huck, barely even a teenager, soon comes to realize the horrifying reality of what he's done. And now, because of his crimes, he knows that his country will punish him, that his community will reject him, and that not even death will be able to save him. Because in the afterlife, God will send Huckleberry Finn to burn in hell forever. So Huck comes up with a plan. He writes a letter, informing Jim's master of his whereabouts. But Huck doesn't send it, he just looks at it and thinks. It's here that the greatest scene in American literature, and perhaps even all of literature, begins. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell, and went on thinking. And got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me, all the time, in the day and in the nighttime. Sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we are floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow, I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his'n, instead of calling me so I could go on sleeping, and see how glad he was when I came back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was and such like times. He would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see the paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling, because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, alright then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. In this scene, American literature is born. Not French, not German, and not Chinese, but American. When Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn decides to go against the morality of his community, his nation, and his God, he did so in a way that could only happen in American literature. Many view Huckleberry Finn as a coming-of-age story, and this is a coming-of-age scene. While this is correct, it misses the point entirely. Huckleberry Finn didn't just decide to become a man, because, while he certainly does that as well, what he really chooses to become is an American. If this scene had happened in any other tradition, then it would have made Huck the villain. He even knows it, going on to say, if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Huckleberry Finn is genre savvy enough to know that if Shakespeare had written his life, then Huck, like all of Shakespeare's other great villains, would spend the rest of his life racked with guilt over his crimes. But Huck never feels that guilt. Instead, he feels like he should be the villain now, but somehow isn't. Meanwhile, if Hawthorne had written this scene, Huck would have considered not sending the letter, just like how Hester Prynne only considered removing her Scarlet Letter. but in the end, he would have succumbed to society's pressure, just like Hester. What all this means is that Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is neither a slave to his society nor a villain. Huckleberry Finn begins, remains, and will always continue to be a fully independent hero. The government can sick the law on him, his community can subject him to scarlet letters, and God can send him straight to hell, and it just doesn't matter. Huck was right, and every one of them was wrong. Through Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain depicts, in all of its ugliness and in all of its beauty, the American way of discovering moral truth. The community does not discover morality, nor does the state, and neither does God. Instead, each man, for himself, discovers morality as best he can, and lives by it to the best of his ability. And that's the origin of American literature. Up next, we'll talk about history. Well, that's not exactly right. We'll be talking about history with libertarians. I'll see you then.